The stage rattled into the Montana settlement under a pale, wind-scoured sky. Snow clung to the wagon wheels like ash. The drifts along the main street hardened into ridges that cracked beneath the hooves of the tired team. Clara Mayfield held her shawl close at the throat, her fingers stiff and white from the cold, though she had been too anxious to feel it during the journey. The moment the coach drew up, she saw the town waiting. Small clusters of faces turned toward her as though they had been expecting some sort of spectacle. She stepped down carefully, boots sinking into frozen mud. Her single trunk was hauled after her, its once bright brass fittings dulled by travel. She smoothed the front of her plain wool dress, her breath clouding in the air. Her eyes searched for the man she had come to meet, the rancher who had answered her letters, promised a new life, and signed himself Thomas Baird. She pictured him taller, perhaps broad of shoulder, with a face carved by wind and welk. But the man who emerged from the crowd bore no trace of welcome. Thomas Baird was heavy-set, his coat lined with fur, his eyes sharp as flint. He looked her over once, from boots to the worn hem of her dress, and his mouth tightened in disdain. "So," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "they send me a widow, a woman touched by sorrow. No wonder you looked eager in your letters. Should have known." Heat burned Clara's cheeks, though the air was bitter cold. "I made no secret of it," she answered, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "My husband was lost to a mine collapse. I wrote the truth plain." Baird waved a dismissive hand. "A man has no need for another man's ill luck. Widowhood carries shadow. Bad fortune breeds more of it. I'll not have that under my roof." The words struck harder than the wind. Around them, townsfolk muttered, some turning away, others watching with hungry curiosity. Clara stood rooted, her pride the only barrier between herself and collapse. She would not weep, not here, not before strangers. Her hands tightened on the shawl, drawing it like armor about her shoulders. Baird turned from her without another word. Two men dragged her trunk aside and left it in the slush, its weight thudding against the frozen earth. One child laughed. His mother hushed him quickly. Boots shuffled, and the little crowd dispersed. The drama concluded. Clara remained alone, her life's belongings at her feet. Her future collapsed into the mud. Only one figure lingered. He had stood apart from the beginning, a man tall and broad-shouldered, his coat plain, hat-brim shadowing eyes that missed little. Sheriff Elias Holt. His badge caught a faint glint of the gray light, though his expression carried no pride of office, only a quiet steadiness, as if he had seen too many such scenes before. He did not speak at first. Instead, he stepped forward, lifted her trunk as though it weighed no more than firewood, and set it onto his shoulder. His silence was not cold, only deliberate, a language of its own. When his gaze met Hayes, it was not pity she saw there, but recognition, a loneliness answering her own. "I've a spare room," he said at last, voice low, roughened by years. "It isn't much. Warped floorboards. Draft through the shutters. But it's dry, and it's yours until you choose what comes next." Clara hesitated. Pride warred with despair. To accept would be to admit she had no other course, no strength to walk the frozen road alone. Yet his tone held no demand, no condescension, only an offering, plain as the coat upon his back. "Very well," she whispered. He gave a single nod, no triumph in it, only quiet acknowledgment. Then he toned, leading her down the street. The town shrank behind them. False-fronted shops, smoke rising thin from chimneys, the sound of a hammer echoing faintly. Beyond lay open land, pines weighted with snow, a sky broad and indifferent. Elias's cabin stood at the edge of it all, weathered logs darkened by storms, smoke curling from the stone chimney. Inside, the air was warm with firelight, the scent of coffee lingering faintly. A rifle rested above the hearth, its barrel polished by use. An old rocking chair sat near the flames, a patchwork quilt draped across its back. The space was sparse, yet orderly, everything in its place, nothing wasted. Elias set her trunk by the wall and stepped aside as though already retreating. Clara moved slowly, her hands brushing the quilt, the table worn smooth by years of solitary meals. The silence pressed heavy, but it was not the suffocating silence of rejection. It was a silence of man accustomed to his own company, now stretched to make room for another. "You may stay as long as you need," he said, standing near the door, His voice was as steady as stone, yet there was something in it, a note of understanding that reached past words. "No one will trouble you here." Clara drew the shawl tighter, her eyes lowering to the fire. She had lost a husband, been spurned by another, and cast aside before a town of strangers. Yet in this moment, in this cabin smelling of wood smoke and coffee, she felt the smallest thread of dignity return. Not because of words, but because of the sheriff's quiet presence, his refusal to let her be discarded in the mud. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the firelight flickered across the scarred wood, across Clara's weary face, and across the man who had offered her not salvation, but shelter. And though she did not yet know his secrets, she sensed that loneliness bound them both, that in his silence he carried burdens that might one day mirror her own. For now, it was enough. The days that followed were hushed and measured, marked by the muted rhythm of life in Elias Holt's cabin. Clara had never lived in such quiet before. Even her widow's rooms back east had been filled with the sound of neighbors through thin walls, the rumble of wagons over cobblestones, the cries of peddlers in the street. Here there was only the groan of timber in the wind, the creak of snow-laden branches outside, and the steady tick of Elias's old mantel clock. She explored her surroundings cautiously, as if stepping into another man's solitude was a trespass. The cabin boy's life in objects few but well kept, the rifle above the hearth, polished by years of handling, the rocking chair worn smooth where broad hands had rested, a row of jars filled with dried herbs, their faint earthy scent mingling with the wood smoke. Even the iron kettle, blackened with use, spoke of a man who lived without fuss, without excess, surviving in steady rhythm. Clara folded her few dresses into a small chest by the wall. The trunk that had carried her west now seemed a coffin of failed hopes, its brass fittings tarnished like the memory of the man who had turned her away. She touched it only when she must, keeping her hands instead upon tasks that made her presence less intrusive, sweeping, stirring the fire, setting coffee to boil in the mornings. Elias accepted her quiet industry without praise or protest, only with the occasional glance, as if making sure she did not vanish like smoke. At night the silence deepened, broken only by the pop of sap in the logs. Clara often sat with her shawl drawn close, watching the fire shift from gold to red, the embers glowing like eyes in the dark. The flames carried her backward to a mine-shaft's lantern light, to the day she had waited by the rails for word of her husband. She remembered the men who returned black with soot, their voices low as they spoke of timbers collapsed, of men buried where no rescue could reach. She remembered the hollow ring in her chest, the sound of her name on pitying lips, and the way neighbors had looked at her as though death itself clung to her shoulders. Her hands trembled in the firelight. She hid them in her lap, swallowing hard against the tide of memory. That was why she had written those letters, to claw her way free of grief, to place her hope in a stranger's promise. And now even that hope had been spat upon in the street. When the tears threatened, she turned her eyes to Elias. He sat often in the rocking chair, broad shoulders bent forward, his scarred hands resting on his knees. The firelight traced the ridges of those scars, each one a story untold. He never spoke of them, and she never asked, but she sensed in them a history of violence and survival, a past no man wished to recall yet could never quite bury. Sometimes, when he thought her asleep, he stared into the flames with a gaze that seemed to pierce beyond the walls, out into the vast, snowbound dark. It was not the look of a man content in solitude. It was the look of a man exiled, bound to something beyond himself, as if the wilderness had claimed him as its own. Rumors stirred in town. Clara had overheard them on her first walk to fetch water. Whispers that Sheriff Holt was not entirely natural, that his strength was uncanny, his night patrols longer than any man could endure. Some said he spoke to wolves, others that he was one beneath the moon. Clara dismissed such talk as frontier superstition, yet a seed of unease lingered, watered by the silence he carried like a second skin. That unease found shape one night in a dream. She stood in a field of snow beneath a hollow moon, her breath steaming white. From the tree line came the sound of paws, soft at first, then circling, tightening. Wolves moved like shadows, their eyes catching the light, their teeth white against the dark. She clutched her shawl, but it slipped from her shoulders, and the cold sank deep into her bones. One wolf stepped forward, larger than the rest, its gaze not hunger but something stranger, watchful, sorrowful. She woke with a cry, heart hammering. The cabin was dark, save for the faint glow of embers. Elias was already at the hearth, coaxing flame from coals, his movements unhurried, steady. He did not ask about her cry. He did not press her with questions. He only added another log, its crackle filling the silence, and poured her a cup of coffee though the hour was still night. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup, the heat biting her palms, and studied him. His presence filled the room more surely than the fire. She wanted to ask about the scars, about the nights he lingered outside the cabin longer than seemed needful, about the restless look in his eyes. Yet the words lodged in her throat. Some secrets, she realized, were as heavy as her own. So she drank in silence, the warmth soothing her tremors. Across from her, Elias sat once more in the rocking chair, his face unreadable in the firelight. But his nearness steadied her, as if the dream circle of wolves had broken apart at his arrival. That night, as dawn edged pale against the shutters, Clara understood something new. Her sorrow was not singular. It was not her burden alone. Pain, rejection, exile, they lived also in this man, carved into his scars and worn into his silence. For the first time since her arrival, she did not feel quite so abandoned. And Elias, though he spoke no word, felt it too, in the quiet between them. He knew that her grief mirrored his own exile, that perhaps the loneliness each bore need not remain unshared. The storm came without warning, rolling down from the mountains like a tide of white. Morning dawned in gray silence, and by noon the wind had risen, sweeping snow across the plains in waves that erased fences and blurred the road to town. By evening, the world outside the cabin was nothing but a world of ice and shadow, as though creation itself had folded inward, leaving Clara and Elias in a cocoon of firelight and timber walls. The cold pressed through the shutters, seeping into the seams of the floor. Elias worked to bank the fire high, while Clara tightened her shawl and took stock of what remained in their stores: a sack of beans, a handful of dried apples, a few strips of salted pork. Not much. She looked to him, expecting the matter-of-fact resignation she had seen in other men when one pressed in, but Elias said nothing. He only glanced at her once, and she read the truth. He would endure hunger without complaint, as he had endured so much else. But she would not. "I can make these last," she said, already setting beans to soak. She found an old shirt in need of mending, a boot with its stitching frayed, tasked to occupy her hands while the wind battered the walls. For the first time since she had come west, she felt useful, not merely a guest or a burden. And in the quiet moments when her needle moved through cloth, she caught Elias watching her, not with pity, but with something like respect. The storm deepened into night. Snow hissed against the chimney, the cabin groaning under its weight. Then came a sound unlike the storm, a thud, followed by a muffled cry. Elias was at the door in an instant, rifle in hand, his body taut. When he pulled the door open, a figure collapsed across the threshold, spilling blood on the snow. It was a youth, scarcely more than 16, his braids matted, his chest scored by a deep cut. Clara gasped, stepping back, but Elias lowered his weapon at once. "Lakota," he said under his breath, as though naming an old acquaintance. With surprising gentleness, he lifted the boy into his arms and carried him to the hearth. Clara's first instinct was fear of the stories she had heard, of raids and reprisals, of the bitterness that seethed between settlers and tribes. Yet the boy's face, pinched with pain, dissolved those tales. He was only a child, wounded, half-frozen. "Boil water," Elias told her, his voice calm but urgent. Without hesitation, Clara obeyed. Together they worked by the fire's glow, Elias holding the boy steady while she cleaned the wound, her hands trembling at first, then steadying as necessity hardened her resolve. The youth stayed, speaking words she could not understand. Elias answered in his tongue, low and reassuring. "You speak with him," Clara whispered, startled. "A little," Elias said, not looking at her. "Enough." Through broken speech and gestures, the boy conveyed fragments: settlers, gunfire, a chase through the snow. His people waited beyond the ridge, but he had been cut off, hunted. Clara's heart tightened. She glanced toward the shuttered windows, half expecting riders to emerge from the storm, demanding the youth's surrender. "Will they come?" she asked. "They might," Elias answered simply, "but he stays until he can walk." It was no boast, no threat, only a fact spoken like stone. Clara felt a shiver pass through her, not of fear, but of the unyielding resolve in his tone. The hours wore on. She bound the boy's wound with strips torn from an old shirt. She spooned warm broth into his lips, coaxing him back from the edge of fever. And in the fragile rise and fall of his breath, she saw something she had not expected, a bridge, however narrow, between her world and his. The child's humanity, laid bare by pain, stripped away the stories of savagery she had been told since girlhood. When at last the boy slept, Clara sat back, exhausted, her hands raw from work. Elias remained by the hearth, watchful, as though he could guard the youth's dreams. She studied him in the flicker of firelight, the breadth of his shoulders, the scar along his jaw, the quiet way he carried burdens that might have broken other men. Later, when the wind howled fiercest, she rose to fetch more wood. Through the crack of the door she glimpsed Elias outside, bare-shouldered despite the raging cold. Snow swirled around him, but he stood unmoved, as though the storm itself acknowledged him. His breath rose in clouds, his gaze fixed on the tree line as though searching for shapes unseen. Clara's hand tightened on the latch. For an instant she thought of the dream that had haunted her sleep. Wolves circling in the snow, eyes burning with watchfulness. A shadow of unease stirred in her chest. Elias's stillness, his strange endurance of the cold, hinted at something beyond her understanding. When he returned inside, he found her at the hearth, her shawl drawn close. She did not speak of what she had seen. He gave no explanation, yet the silence between them was thick with questions unasked. The storm raged on, isolating them deeper into the wilderness. But within the cocoon of firelight, another truth had taken root. Clara had seen Elias's secret kindness in the way he sheltered the Lakota youth, risking town's wrath. And Elias had seen in Clara a compassion that defied fear, a strength beneath a grief that might one day heal them both. Neither said it aloud. Words were brittle things against storms. But the knowledge lingered, as certain as the snow outside and the fire that kept them alive within. The storm lingered for days, weaving its white silence around the cabin until it seemed the world beyond no longer existed. Time shrank to the space within those log walls, where two lives moved in quiet orbit around one another. In the mornings, Clara would wake to the hiss of the kettle already on the fire, her cup waiting at the hearth. She never saw Elias prepared, but she knew it was his doing, his way of acknowledging her presence without words. She drank it slowly, savoring the warmth, and sometimes caught him watching her over the rim of his own tin mug. Evenings brought their own quiet rituals. Clara sat near the lamplight, combing and braiding her hair, the strands catching the glow like woven copper. Elias, seated in his rocking chair, pretended to mend tack or sharpen his knife, but his eyes lifted often, as though drawn against his will. No words passed between them about these small intimacies, yet they stitched an invisible thread between their silences. Still, she sensed something restless in him, a tautness that deepened as the nights grew longer. He would step outside into the storm, coatless, vanishing into the dark, returning with snow clinging to his shoulders yet no shiver in his frame. When she asked where he went, he gave no answer beyond a shrug. His silence was not indifference but a barrier, one she longed to understand, yet feared to cross. By the fourth day, the storm broke enough for Elias to ride into town for supplies. Clara stayed behind, tending the cabin, watching the snow melt into rivulets along the eaves. When he returned, his jaw was set, and his eyes carried the weight of something unspoken. He said nothing, but she felt the change in the air between them. It was only later, when she herself ventured into town, that she learned the cause. Whispers followed her at the mercantile, that the sheriff harbored strays, first an abandoned widow, then a wounded Lakota boy, that his cabin had become a refuge for cast-offs, a place where the law bent for pity's sake. She overheard one woman mutter that perhaps Holt himself was more beast than man, for why else would he keep such company? The words clung to Clara all the way home. That evening, as the firelight softened the cabin shadows, she laid down her mending and turned to Elias. "They speak ill of me in town," she said quietly, "of you, for sheltering me. I cannot, will not, be the cause of your standing crumbling. If I leave, they will forget soon enough." Elias lifted his gaze from the fire. His expression did not soften. "You will not leave." "It may be best," she pressed, her voice trembling against her own resolve. "You've given me kindness enough. I'll not repay it with shame." His reply came sharp, almost stern. No, the word cut through the air with the finality of a rifle shot. Then, more quietly, I will not see you cast aside again. There was no tenderness in his tone, yet his refusal bore more weight than any comfort could. It was as if her fate, for the first time, was anchored not in rejection but in his will to protect. She felt the strength of it settle in her chest, warming the place where loneliness had lived too long. That night, long after Elias had retreated to his chair, Clara lay awake listening. At first it was only the creak of the timbers, the soft crackle of embers. Then came another sound, faint but distinct, the crunch of paws in the snow, circling the cabin. She held her breath, every muscle taut. A low growl rolled through the night, close, almost at the very wall where her bed lay. She expected Elias to stir, to reach for his rifle, but instead she heard the slow rise of his boots across the floor. The door opened. Cold swept in. Silence followed. When at last the door closed again, Elias returned without word or weapon, his steps unhurried, his body calm. Clara lay rigid in the dark, heart pounding, until his rocking chair creaked once more and the room filled again with the steady rhythm of his presence. She did not ask what had moved outside, nor why his return carried no urgency. Yet the unease lodged deeper, mingling strangely with a sense of safety. Whatever shadow prowled the snow, Elias was bound to it, perhaps even part of it, and still she felt safer in his silence than she had ever felt in the company of men who offered words without substance. By the time dawn came pale across the shutters, Clara knew she was no longer merely a guest in his cabin. She had become entwined with his solitude, her presence woven into the rhythms of his life as surely as a shawl draped across his shoulders. And Elias, though he held his secret close, battled within himself, the need to confess, the fear of what such confession might bring. The storm outside had loosened its grip, but within the cabin a different tension gathered, quiet and powerful, waiting for the moment when silence could no longer contain it. The storm had eased, but peace did not follow. By the end of the week, trouble came riding up the sheriff's road. Clara was at the window when she saw them. 5 men on horseback, their faces wrapped against the cold, eyes hard beneath their brims. Their horses stamped in blue clouds of frost into the air. The sight of them set her stomach tight. Elias was already at the door before their fists struck it. He opened it wide, standing tall, his rifle resting but not raised. Clara stayed near the hearth, her shawl gathered about her, though her pulse raced like a drum. The spokesman spat into the snow. "We've had enough, Holt. First you shelter an abandoned woman. Now you tend a Lakota stray like is your kin. It ain't fit for a man sworn to uphold the law." Another voice, sharp with contempt, followed. "You side with enemies. You'll share their fate. Turn them both out. Tonight." The words struck Clara like stones. Her breath caught, but Elias did not flinch. His gaze swept across the men, unyielding as the mountains. "No one is turned out from my door," he said, his voice even, though the weight of it silenced the wind for a moment. Anger stirred among the riders. One shifted in the saddle, hand near his pistol. "Don't make us force your hand, Sheriff. You're sworn to this town, not to cast-offs and strays." Clara's legs shook, but she forced herself forward, past the threshold of her fear. "You speak of strays," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Yet you know nothing of what this man has given. He asked for no thanks, no coin, no promise. He sheltered me when I had nothing but shame left. He tends a hurt without asking who they are or what they've done. That is law enough, stronger than your threats." The words surprised even her. They rang into the cold with more force than she imagined she possessed. Elias glanced at her, something unreadable passing through his eyes, perhaps pride, perhaps sorrow. The men muttered, shifting uneasily. They had come for weakness, for ease of surrender, not for defiance. At last their leader spat again into the snow. "So be it. Don't say we didn't warn you." They turned their horses, riding back toward town, their silhouettes swallowed by the pines. Only when they were gone did Clara feel her strength falter. She sank onto the chair by the fire, her hands trembling. Elias closed the door and stood in silence. He offered no reassurance, only the presence of a man who had chosen his ground and would not move from it. Night came hard with its own peril. Smoke rose against the stars, black and bitter. Shouts carried on the wind. From the cabin window, Clara saw the glow, the barn at the edge of town, flames licking its roof. Elias seized his rifle and pulled his coat tight. "Stay here," he said, voice low, firm as iron. Then he strode into the night, his horse's hooves pounding into the frozen earth. But Clara could not stay. Fear knotted her chest, but a deeper pull drove her, the knowledge that whatever burden he bore, whatever secrets lingered in his silence, she would not let him face them alone. She wrapped her shawl tight and followed the fire's glow into the valley. The barn was an inferno, sparks leaping skyward. Townsfolk shouted, hauling water, driving livestock from a blaze. And in the midst of it, Elias fought, not with pistol shots, but with his very body, hurling back the raiders who had set the fire. His movements were not of any ordinary man. In the fire's flicker, Clara saw it. His strength more than human, his eyes catching the light like an animal's, his growls mingling with the crack of wood and the raw flames. For one breathless moment, she saw the truth, the shadow of the wolf in him, the secret that the whispers in town had circled. It was no rumor. He bore within him a wildness, a curse, a burden he carried in silence. She expected fear to seize her, to recoil as others might. Instead, what she felt was recognition. His secret was not unlike her own widowhood, her rejection, her shame, the mark of fate carried alone, misunderstood by others. He fought not as a beast, but as a man refusing surrender, a man bound by something greater than fear. When the raiders fled into the dark and the fire was beaten back to embers, Elias stood apart, shoulders heaving, face shadowed. The townsfolk kept their distance, suspicion sharp in their eyes. Clara alone stepped forward, shawl drawn close against the night. Back at the cabin, Elias expected silence, perhaps even dread. He set his rifle aside with slow hands, avoiding her gaze. But when he turned, she was already seated by the hearth, the shawl draped across her shoulders, her face steady though pale from what she had witnessed. "I know," she said softly. "I saw." He stiffened, the words he had long feared hanging heavy in the air. Yet she did not recoil, did not accuse. She only added, "A curse carried alone is heavier than one shared. Solitude can be borne by two. Scars, on flesh or on spirit, can bind rather than divide." Elias stood unmoving, the fire painting his face in red and gold. For the first time since she had known him, she saw the shadow of relief touch his eyes, fragile and fleeting, like dawn breaking through storm. She had not spoken of love, nor promise, but what she offered was true, a place beside her where loneliness no longer ruled unchallenged. And Elias, though silence remained his habit, understood. His exile need not last forever. The days that followed the fire carried both quiet and unease. Snow fell thick, blanketing the valley, softening the scars left by flame. In Elias's cabin, the Lakota youth healed, the color returning to his cheeks, his eyes no longer clouded by pain. Clara tended him with calm hands, spooning broth, changing bandages, speaking little but offering steadiness. The boy's gratitude shone in gestures more than words, his dark eyes resting often on her with something like wonder. At last, when he was strong enough to ride, a small party came for him. They arrived at the edge of Holt's land. 3 riders, proud and solemn, their braids bound with leather, their faces lined by weather and time. Elias went out to meet them, his movement slow, deliberate, respectful. Clara watched from the porch, her shawl gathered at her throat, the cold biting her cheeks. The elder dismounted, his long gray braid falling across his shoulder. He and Elias spoke in low tones that Clara could not catch, yet she read the weight of it in their stillness. The grave nods exchanged, the hand briefly pressed to Elias's arm. The boy mounted, casting one last glance toward the cabin before they rode away, vanishing into the pines as if the snow itself had swallowed them whole. It struck Clara then how rare such a moment was. 2 worlds meeting without violence, a fragile peace carried in silence. Elias returned to the porch, his face unreadable, but in the lines around his eyes she saw the strain of years, the cost of walking always between 2 fires. But peace did not settle in town. Whispers rose instead, harsher than before. The men who had come once now gathered again, their voices sharpened by fear and suspicion. It was near dusk when they rode up the path once more, their numbers greater, their intent clear. Clara stood inside the doorway, her heart steady though her body trembled. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle across his arm but pointed low. He said nothing, waiting. The leader, the same man with anger etched into his brow, called out, "This ends now. Holt, we will not have her here. A widow shamed and refused, clinging to you like a shadow. She brings nothing but trouble." The words struck like lashes, but Clara did not shrink. She pushed the door wide and stepped past Elias, her boots sinking into the snow. The cold bit her skin, but her voice came clear, carried by something stronger than fear. "I have been cast aside before," she said, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. "Once by fate, once by a man who thought me unworthy. But hear me now. I will not be thrown away again. I stand here by choice, not by pity. You may scorn me, but you will not move me." The men shifted, surprised by her defiance, some looking away. Elias did not speak, yet his presence beside her was a wall stronger than any words. He did not need to bear his secret, nor raise his weapon. His stillness, his unyielding watchfulness, carried its own weight. The silence stretched. Snow drifted down, each flake settling on brim and coat, softening the sharp edges of anger. At last, the leader spat into the snow, muttered something bitter, and turned his horse. One by one, the others followed, their threat dissolving into the night. Clara felt her knees weaken, but she remained upright until the last hoofbeat faded. Only then did Elias glance at her, his eyes holding something rare, approval, perhaps even a quiet awe. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Neither spoke of what had passed, for there was no need. The storm had broken, and in its wake lay something steadier than relief, a bond tempered by trial, forged in silence. When morning came, Elias saddled his horse. Clara stepped out, the shawl drawn close, watching the snow-laden pines stretch endless before them. He offered no speech, no vow, only a hand to help her mount. She took it without hesitation. The ride was quiet, the only sound the creak of leather and the muffled crunch of hooves through snow. But within Clara, a warmth grew, deeper than fire, steadier than hope alone. She had come west as a bride cast aside, burdened by shame and loss. Now she rode not as a cast-off, but as a woman who had stood her ground, who had found in solitude not exile but strength, and beside her a man who shared that strength without demand, without promise, only presence. The pines closed around them, tall and hushed, as though the earth itself bore witness. Snow fell, soft as a benediction, and in the silence of the ride, Clara knew she was no longer abandoned. She was home,